Hi, everybody. Hope you're having a good day. I hope you enjoyed your weekend. So we just finished up 9.1, which was simplifying our radicals, our square roots, right? So we're actually going to jump to 9.3, and that's going to be solving for x. We're going to be solving an equation by using square roots, okay? So we'll get to that in a minute. I just want to show you how everything's connected, especially from last chapter and this chapter. Okay, so we kind of know actually already how to do this, right? So it says solve the quadratic using the graph. So what this in chapter 9 is all about is solving for x, okay? So what we looked at last chapter was getting the intercept, and that is solving for x. So let's just jot that down. Solving for, you don't have this in your notes, but that's okay. Solving for x, just so you have it later on when I give you the answer key for the notes. So solving for x is getting the intercepts on a graph, is getting the x-intercepts on a graph, okay? And then, so there's different ways to solve. So on a graph, you're finding the x-intercepts, and then we'll move on to other ways to solve after this if you don't have a graph. So if you look at number 1, where are my x-intercepts? And if you could see it, it looks like, right, x equals -1 right here, and x equals 3. So x equals -1 and x equals 3. Those are your answers. And again, looking at this equation, there's other ways to solve that, but when you're given a graph, it's really nice if you just look at where the graph, where the parabola is crossing the x-axis. So same thing over here. Let's take a look. So if I look at just this equation, all right, well, maybe I don't know exactly what to do yet. We will eventually, but if you're just looking at the equation. But again, you have this nice graph here. So I know what x equals. I know that x is equal to, let's say it's 1, 2 right here, and 4. So x equals 2 and x equals 4. So that's why we did our intercepts last chapter. And again, solving by graphing is one way to solve a quadratic equation, being this. This is a type of quadratic equation, and this is a type of quadratic equation. As long as you have an x squared, that's your quadratic equation, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So the next thing we're doing, that's our 9 points. So this is one way of solving by graphing. And our next way of solving is by using square roots, okay? So we are solving solving quadratic equations by using square roots. So again, that's why we just simplified our square roots, because those are the types of answers we're going to be getting. If you want, you can look at this. I'm going to explain it through examples, and then it may make a little bit more sense if you come back to this. All right, so let's look at an example. And there's a couple of things that you have to remember when you're solving using square roots, okay? So one thing that you have to remember, and I'm going to just, I'm going to move this all down. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to put a couple notes up at the top here. Okay, so one thing that you really have to remember is you have to get the x squared, and I'm going to write my x squared by itself before taking the square root. Okay, so look at letter A. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Look at letter A. Do you see the x squared is completely by itself? So I can take the square root. Okay, jump to letter B. You notice I have a -10 with the x squared. So that means I have to get this -10 out of there. And we'll do that in a minute. But again, and look at letters C and D. X squared is not by itself. We're going to get it by itself, but you have to know to do that before taking the square root. Okay, another thing you have to remember, another part of our notes, I'm going to just jot down at the top. When you are solving and taking a square root, this is really important, you have to have a plus or minus answer. Okay, so again, I'm going to explain what that means once we get to our examples, okay? So those are the two main things that we have going on here. You have to get the x squared by itself before taking the square root. And when you are solving and taking the square root, you have to have a plus or minus answer. Okay, so let's go down here. So my x squared is by itself, so I'm good. So that means I can take the square root. I'm going to do the best I can with my marker here. I'm going to take the square root over here, because that's our inverse operation, because they'll now cancel each other out. And I'm going to take my square root over here. So I cancel out my squared and my square root. So what I'm left with is x. Perfect. And then Well, don't we know what the square root of 81 is? We do. It's a 9. But based on my second thing of notes, it has to be a plus minus. So what I mean by that is you can either write x is equal to 9 and comma, x is equal to negative 9. Another way to write it, which is known, like very familiar in the math world, so that you can know now, is that you write plus or minus 9. It's a positive and a negative answer. And the reason being is because if I plug that 9 back in here, well, 9 times 9 is 81. Well, what's negative 9 times negative 9? Excellent. It is still a positive 81. That's why both answers work. We do not mind how you write it. You can write it as 9 and negative 9, or you can write it as plus or minus 9. All right, let's take a look at the next one. So like I said before, this negative 10 is here. I got to get rid of that. I got to move it to the other side. All right, well, let's do that. I'm going to add 10 to both sides, right? Let's add 10, cross those guys out. Let's add 10 over here. So on the left side, right, I'm left with x squared. Okay, on the right side, what happens? What's a negative 10 and a positive 10? Right, it's 0. Okay, fine. We can still take the square root. So let's take the square root of x squared, and let's take the square root of 0. So like I said in my second thing in notes, you have to have a plus or minus. But is there such a thing as plus or minus 0? Nope, it's not positive or negative. So in this case, it is just 0. So x is equal to 0. Okay, let's keep going. I'm going to move these guys down a little bit. All right. Let me move them actually even a little bit further so I have enough room. Okay, let's take a look at letter C. So again, notice that x squared right here, right? We have to get, let me show you, just this part by itself. That means we got to move everything else, right? So let's move our 27 first. We're going to add 27 to both sides. You guys can do that, right? So we're going to add 27 here. We're going to add 27 here. Great. Okay, what am I left with? Well, I'm left with 3x squared equals, okay, now I'm going to go back and forth between my marker and because sometimes it's easier for me to just type it. Okay, what are we going to do from here? We're going to divide by 3, right? We're going to divide by 3 on both sides. Great. So we get x squared is equal to, well, 27 divided by 3 is 9. Okay, go back to my thing because it's easier rather than me typing. And okay, good. So now I get x squared equals 9. Well, now, isn't my x squared by itself? It sure is. So now I can take the square root of it, both sides. So I take the square root of x squared and I take the square root of 9. So we are left with my x squared and, I'm sorry, my squared and my square root cancel each other out. So you're left with x equals, I don't know if I can do that, plus or minus. Oh yeah, maybe I can. Yep, there you go. Plus or minus, and what is the square root of 9? 3. So my answer is x equals a positive 3 and a negative 3. Perfect. There you go. And let's go to the next one. Okay, so what am I going to do here? I'm going to subtract 11 on both sides, right? Subtract 11 here. Let's subtract 11 here. There we go. And what do I get? Okay, well, these positive 11 and negative 11 cancel out. So I'm left with negative 5x squared. 5 is very hard for me to write. Negative 5x squared is equal to, well, what's 16 minus 11? 16 minus 11 is 5. Okay, great. That doesn't look good. I'm going to write that over here. Okay, so let's keep going. My x squared is not yet by itself. So let's divide by negative 5 on both sides, right? Negative 5, negative 5. Okay, here we go. Cross those guys out. I'm left with x squared is equal to what? I'm left with x squared is equal to, well, 5 divided by negative 5, right, is a negative 1. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So x squared is equal to negative 1. All right, here we go. So if I take the square root, if you have a calculator nearby, plug this in your calculator. Put x squared equals negative 1. Take the square root of a negative 1. So x equals, what happens in your calculator? If you do the square root of negative 1, what actually happens in your calculator is you get a math error or domain error or syntax error or something that says error. And that's because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So if you're trying to take the square root of any negative number, your answer is actually, and this one I'm going to type, is actually no solution. Your answer is no solution. X does not equal anything. There is nothing you can plug into this equation that will allow this equation to work. This equation will never work. So there is no solution. Okay, and again, that's because this is a negative number. You're trying to take the square root of a negative number, and you cannot do that. It's not possible for real numbers. Okay, so it's no real solution. All right, let's take a look at the next one. So now these are all very similar to what we're doing. We're going to divide by 2 because our x squared is not by itself yet, right? We want to get the x squared by itself. So take the divide by 2, and you're left with x squared is equal to 32. Okay, so this goes back to what we just did in 9.1 because 32 is actually not a perfect square. So let's do the same thing that we've been doing. We're going to take the square root of both sides. Great. And you're going to get x is equal to, all right, here we go. Well, let's go back to what we did in 9.1. What's the biggest perfect square that divides into 32? Go back to your perfect square list if you need to. I'll help you out with this one. It's the square root of 16. That's your biggest perfect square times what's left over? Square root of 2. And we know that the square root of 16 is 4. And we know what's left over is root 2. And remember, go back to my second note, right? No matter what, just because it's not a perfect square, it doesn't mean when you're solving and taking a square root, you have to have a plus or minus answer. Plus and minus, I should say. So x equals plus or minus 4 square root 2. I'm just going to write my x equals over here. So your answer is x equals plus or minus 4 root 2. So that's why we had to simplify in 9.1, okay? All right, let's take a look at letter F. What am I going to do? I'm going to subtract 4 because my x squared is not by itself yet. I'm going to subtract 4 over here. Great, here we go. You're going to get x squared, wow, that looks crazy, is equal to 80. So again, we know that that's not a perfect square, not one of our perfect squares. So we're going to do the same thing that we did in letter E. We're going to take our square root still, normal, square root. Don't mind the writing. And you're going to get x is equal to, again, let's pick the biggest perfect square that divides into 80. Now think about it for a second. It's actually going to be 16 again. So we're going to get the square root of 16 times the square root of 5, right? Because that gets me back to 80. And I know that the square root of 16 is 4, right? So I'm going to say x equals, I'm going to put it down right away so I know to remember, plus or minus 4 is my square root of 16, and I'm left with root 5. So my answer is plus or minus root 5. Good? All right, pause it for a minute, and then you guys are going to do the tries. All right, here they are. You guys try them, and then I'll give you the answers. All right, pause it for a second. Okay, did you pause it? And did you try it? Let's see how you did. So for the first one, number 1, I got x equals plus or minus 5. For number 2, I got no solution. That's because when I subtracted 12, I got x squared equals negative 2. And again, you cannot take the square root of a negative number, so it is no solution. For number 3, we're going to get our answer is x equals 0. Again, no plus or minus because there's no such thing as a plus or minus 0, so it is just 0. For number 4, we added 5. We divided by 3. We get the square root of 9. So in this case, it's x equals plus or minus 3. Okay, that's what you should have gotten for try number 4. And then let's take a look at try number 5. We divided by 6. So we should have gotten that x is equal to, and again, plus or minus. And this one's going to be 2 root 3. Why am I doing that root 3? Hold on. 2 root 3 is what we should have had left over. Because it was the square root of 12, and that simplifies to 2 root 3. Over here, we're going to add that 10. So we should have gotten x equals plus or minus. And this one became 5 root 2. Let me write that root 2 there. And here we go, 5 root 2. Good? All right, those are what you should have gone for the tries. And then, hold on one moment.